All right, so we're actually going to be leaving the Roman Empire, which I know I've been talking about a lot recently, and we're going to head over to the Middle East, where we're going to see one of the most iconic sites there and the most iconic site in Israel, Masada.
We're off on the road to Judea. We certainly do get around. Boom, ticky boom, ticky boom, ticky boom, ticky boom.
Now, this is an interesting case study for us as a site because it involves historical and biblical archaeology, which is a challenge because you're trying to reconcile historical and biblical written sources with the material record, and they don't always match. Also, it's a case of archaeology and the intersection of that with politics and religion, which adds another angle to it. So our tale begins way back in the Roman Empire again, at a time we've already looked at. We're going to AD 66. Remember, we've already talked about the Roman invasion of Britain in the Bath episode, and that was AD 43. So these times are very close together. Now, it was at this time, AD 66, when the Jews of ancient Israel were revolting.
It is said that the people are revolting.
You said it. They stink on ice.
Well, wrong millennium, but you get the idea. The Jews in the Holy Land were pissed. And at this time, in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Jewish population was actually a dominant population, a very large population of the region. And for a lot of reasons, basically mostly dealing with Roman colonialist oppression, it was not going well. But just like Queen Boudica in Britain 5 years before this, these guys made a really bonehead move. You do not revolt against the Roman Empire at its peak. And just like Queen Boudica's fate,
I am Boudica. You are my people. We're in a time of extreme peril. We fight for our freedom.
the revolt was quickly put down. Now, it's important to note that this was actually the first of a series of wars called the Jewish Wars, which would engulf the Roman Empire over the next 70 years. I don't think it's totally clear what actually lit the fuse that started this, but I'm guessing it was a lot like what was happening in Britain and caused the revolt there. Basically, increased demands for tribute, repression, taxation, and outright theft by the Roman imperialists. Now, this was led by a group called the Zealots. Literally, the modern word zealot comes from this. But these guys weren't actually particularly religiously pious.
We're gathered here today because we are spiritual, but not like religious, you know?
They were actually more like a group of political radicals. And believe it or not, the other Jews didn't particularly appreciate them either. It seems that the bulk of the Jewish population were happy to protest, but they knew the dangers of open revolt against the Roman Empire. So those zealots, they're actually referred to as biryonim in the Talmud, which is one of the key Jewish religious texts. And that basically means they're a bunch of ruffians. And in fact, a particularly violent and radical group called the Sicarii, well, they splintered away from the main group of zealots. And they seem to have spent as much or more of their time attacking moderate Jews who they saw as collaborators than actually attacking the Romans themselves. Well, how do we know about all this, you ask? We know about it through a guy named Josephus, who seemed to be a perfectly placed, if not totally reliable historian.
Hey, Josephus! Hey, motherfucker!
Like many others, Josephus was captured and set to be sold into slavery. But somehow he got the ear of the Roman general Vespasian. And Josephus told Vespasian of a suspiciously flattering prophecy that he supposedly had, which was that Vespasian was soon to be the Roman emperor. And unlike all of Miss Cleo's prophecies, this one, it actually came true.
With the help of the spirits and my tarot cards, I can see your life even more clearly than you can yourself.
Anyway, this all had the desired effect on Vespasian, who rescued Josephus from the auction block and made Josephus his own personal slave. But to be the slave of the commanding general is not what you're thinking. He was an interpreter and was treated well, and it was probably actually a position of some kind of honor. And remember, Josephus had been a leader in the rebellion, so he knew where all the bodies were buried. So he served as Vespasian's interpreter for the next couple of years until 2 years later when Vespasian became the emperor. At that time, Josephus' services transferred over to Titus, Vespasian's son, who then became the leading general in the area upon his father's departure. And Josephus stayed with Titus through the whole conflict and was finally freed by Titus at the end and actually honored. This all gave Josephus a unique insight into the history of the times, having been a learned man and a leader on both sides. Now, Josephus would go on to write 4 books, The Jewish War, The Antiquity of the Jews, then one critiquing the Greeks and sort of positing the Judaism as the origin of philosophy, and also an autobiography. He went on to live a bunch more decades until AD 100, when he died at age 63, which was a ripe old age for the time. Now, for this episode, we're going to focus on that first book, The Jewish War. Like I said, this first war in which Josephus was captured, it did not go well for the Jews. They held out a couple years, but eventually the Second Temple, the holiest of holies for the Jews, was destroyed. That's actually where the Temple Mount is, the Dome of the Rock today, so that's what you'd recognize. Now, at this point, the Jews were enslaved, expelled from the Holy Land, and basically became a discriminated population in all over the Roman Empire, and they were a wandering people. So this was the beginning of the Jewish diaspora. Now, actually, the Jewish population in the East, in Babylon, or what is today Iraq, especially the city of Baghdad, that flourished as a result, and that's probably where the Talmud was written. Well, in the immediate aftermath of the temple's destruction, that radical splinter group, the Sicarii, they went rogue. And this is the time when they supposedly, through trickery, captured this old fort that had been built by King Herod, very infamous name in history, 100 years prior to that. Now, this fort was ideally located on the top of a mesa, so very defensible position, with great views onto the plains below and the River Jordan and the Dead Sea. They then based themselves at Masada and had a pretty successful go at raiding the Romans, and especially raiding Jews who they saw as collaborators. And it's important to mention that raiding is basically a historical euphemism for robbing, killing, and destroying. So they did a lot of that, supposedly killing 700 Jews in one go. So yeah, way back in the day, the Sicarii must have not been very popular among their fellow Jews. By the year 72, the Romans caught up with the Sicarii at Masada and surrounded the place. But one problem: how to get up. There was just one narrow path leading up to the fort that ran directly below the defenses, and presumably lots of projectiles hurled down by the defenders. And for their part, the Sicarii were happy to wait it out. You see, they had plenty of water, thanks to an elaborate system of channels and cisterns that collected water from the nearby wadi. And if you want to know what a wadi is, you can go back and look at the last news episode where I talk about that with Oman. But anyway, the defending Sicarii had plenty of water, and they actually also had a place to grow crops up there. So they were just happy to wait it out. So to get around this, the Romans undertook a huge feat by constructing a giant ramp made of dirt, of earth. Now, modern investigations have shown that this was actually built on top of a natural spur of the mountain, but it still was no easy feat. And once they did that, it was really just a matter of time. They brought up a huge battering ram and they breached the walls of Masada. But upon entering, they were greeted with a horrific sight, which is that everyone in the fort had committed mass suicide rather than being taken slaves. Now, that actually kind of makes sense. According to Josephus, there were just 960 people inside it, men, women, and children, and they were up against 8,000 or 9,000 fighting men of the Roman army and all of their retainers and hangers-on. So apparently, after an eloquent speech, or I believe 2, the Jews were convinced by their leader Eleazar to do the deed and, Harry Carey.
Wait a minute, Mikey. But if he killed all his men, how did the map or the story get out?
Well, I'm glad you asked, Chunk. According to Josephus, there were 7 survivors, 2 women and 5 children, so they presumably told him what happened. But that pretty much closes the book on the story of Masada. It was a remote fort in a desert land that had been depopulated by the Romans, who killed everyone and sold them to slavery. It was hanging out on the south shore of the Dead Sea, which is dead, so there really wasn't any reason for people to go there for a very long time. It was not rediscovered until 1828 by a couple of Americans traveling through by chance. And the first test excavations would have to wait until 1959. And then a few more years after that, from 1963 to 65, with the first massive excavations, which were led by Israeli archaeologist Yigael Yadin, who was the former chief of staff of the Israeli military. And he would later go on to become deputy prime minister. So he led this huge excavation of the whole mesa, which involved thousands of volunteers, Christians and Jews from all over the world. And the findings he had were stunning. Here are some of the highlights. In terms of buildings, there were the defenses, 2 palaces, residential houses, storehouses, Roman-style bathhouses, and a synagogue, as well as those waterworks I mentioned before and that earthen ramp. The extreme dryness of the place made for some amazing preservation, and this is just crazy. They found the seed of a date palm that actually came from the time of the Sicarii Rebellion. And in the 1960s, they were able to germinate that seed into a date palm plant. Who even knew that that was possible? They found hundreds of inscribed potsherd, and one of the really interesting ones had something written on it that basically translated into the king's garum. Now, what made this so interesting is that King Herod, who I mentioned before, he actually liked his luxury.
I heard that King Herod is bringing in gambling. Let's go, Miracle.
And he supposedly spent a fortune on a garum imported from Spain. Now, garum is a fermented fish sauce similar to what they eat all over Southeast Asia, actually. And we were told about this by Pliny the Elder, a Roman historian who we already discussed in this podcast, that died in the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. And according to Josephus, he actually said the store of garum that King Herod amassed was worth more than the palace itself.
It's good to be the king.
They also found a potsherd with the name Ben Yair on it, and that may have been short for Eleazar Ben Yair, who was the commander of the fortress. Remember, the guy who convinced everyone supposedly to kill themselves. Another potsherd bore the name Cohen, which is sort of the high priest in ancient Israel. So the thought was that this was the sort of bowl for collecting tzedakah, or the tithe, for the high priest. And guess what? The name Cohen, that's actually my name, so I was kind of excited to see that. In a few locations, like the synagogue, they actually found scraps of scrolls, similar to like the Dead Sea Scrolls, also not that far from here. And these were various holy books of the Jewish Bible. One of them was actually a fragment of dry bones in the book of Ezekiel.
Dry bones, Ezekiel cried them. Dry bones, Ezekiel cried them. Dry bones, now hear the word of the Lord.
Perhaps the most interesting all were the human remains, which were actually pretty sparse, but did tell us quite a bit about the site. In the bathhouse, they actually found the remains of 2 adult males, or perhaps 1 adult and 1 juvenile male. And this is crazy, too. They found preserved braided hair of a female. And that's just so hard to believe because hair very rarely survives. But it gives you a sense of how good the preservation is in a climate like this, that the hair did survive. And that is so interesting and tells us so much because they were able now to leverage some historical and biblical sources to learn more about this. So first, the science, the forensic analysis showed that this hair had actually been shaved off with a sharp object while the woman was living. Now, the book of Deuteronomy describes the shaving of the hair of a woman would be something that would happen when she was captured. And then, moreover, other biblical sources describe braided hair to be that of a married woman. So a married woman braided her hair. So taking that all together, it's quite possible that this is the hair of a woman that the Sicarii captured and enslaved and brought with them up to the mountaintop. The majority of the remains, however, were very fragmentary, so much so that they're not even sure how many individuals they represent, probably something like 24. And these were found in a cave at the base of the hill, which is kind of odd. But anyway, in 1969, the Israeli religious authorities declared that these were valiant defenders of the fort, Jews, and they were buried with full honors. The problem with that? Later analysis also showed that among the bones were pig bones. And if you know anything about Jews and kosher and Islam and halal for that matter, Jews and pigs do not go together.
How does that pig hate Jewish people?
So what's a more likely interpretation? Well, they could have been civilians from a later time, or they actually could have been Roman soldiers who were sometimes known to sacrifice pigs before a battle. But we can't even do any proper dating because the remains are buried and gone already, inaccessible. Other than hosting a small isolated Byzantine monastic community in the 7th century AD, the site was basically forgotten. And in this dry climate, that actually created the perfect conditions for preservation, almost offering a kind of Pompeii premise-like situation. Basically every archaeologist's dream. From an archaeology point of view, what's of interest here? Well, first, it shows the power of historical archaeology. Now, granted, Josephus is not necessarily the most reliable narrator, and he does make a few boo-boos. He says we'd find one palace, we found two. He claims we'd find remnants of an even older structure earlier than Herod's palace, and no traces of that were found. But there were some coins from the earlier era found. He also seems to have exaggerated the height and strength of the defenses, but guess what? He wouldn't be the first douchebag on the winning side who did that, especially in Roman times. Often the military stuff was exaggerated to make the winners seem more heroic for their great victory. Those speeches he talks about from Eleazar exhorting the people to kill themselves, well, that's a little sus. He probably wouldn't have had time to do that, and it's also highly unlikely the two traumatized women and the children would have been able to remember those. So it's not likely that that happened. But guess what? Roman historians did that all the time, inventing dramatic speeches in the heat of battle. And guess who else likes to do that? Hollywood. And they often stick out pretty badly in the movies.
With great power comes great responsibility.
I believe there's a hero in all of us that keeps us honest, gives us strength, makes us noble, and finally allows us to die.
None of that stuff really bothers me. It's very common among ancient writers, and it doesn't really take away from the broad historical brushstrokes of Josephus's story. However, there is one controversial and very glaring fact, which is that the osteological evidence actually does not support the idea of a mass suicide. If anything, it seems to point to the fact that there are so few bodies, the people were probably carted off and sold as slaves as per usual. Of the remains that were found, the only two that seem to perhaps have been suicide were the two guys in the bathhouse, and for the lady whose hair that was, we really don't know. Now, what's pretty sus is that the whole mass suicide story actually seems to have been borrowed by Josephus by the siege of Jodfat. That was the battle in which he himself was captured. And that battle itself and the accounting of it is also a little weird, considering he talks about tens of thousands of people, and it's very unlikely that that many people would have been involved in a battle at this time. And once again, it's quite common that writers of this time exaggerate those numbers. And though, again, this doesn't change the sort of broad historical narrative that Josephus presents, the fact that there doesn't seem to have been a big mass suicide definitely takes the wind out of the sails of the heroic narrative that was spun around this site. You see, for Israelis, this site represents heroic resistance and the willingness to die by your own hand rather than be taken by as a slave, essentially victory forever. Now, the problem with that is, of course, all those people who died in the cave, the ones with the pig bones, well, they don't seem to have been Jews. And those people up in the bathhouse where Josephus actually said there were suicides, well, they were first presented, it was suggested anyway, that they were a family, and there's very scant archaeological evidence, and what evidence there is seems to suggest that that's not true. And remember, this whole heroic narrative was being spun around this group of particularly violent and zealous, zealots, people who killed a lot of other Jews. To be honest, they sound more like a group of assholes than a group of heroes. And remember the context. The excavations happened just about 15 years into the founding of the modern nation of Israel, although actually the publications would be decades later, actually even after Yadin, the lead excavator, had died. In fact, Masada was so important in the Israeli psyche that until the 1980s, all members of the Israeli Defense Forces had their induction ceremonies here as a symbol of the defiance and survival of the Jewish people. And remember, in Israel, everyone has to serve in the Israeli Defense Forces, all men and women. So there was a lot of myth-making and nation-building going on here. What are we to make of it? Forgetting what we think for a moment about these Sicarii, the fact is Masada does establish the fact that Israel was the ancient homeland of the Jews. Not that there was ever any real doubt about that. But does that give modern Jews the right to claim the land as their homeland? That was in 1947. What about all the populations that settled later? This also raises the point of past-present continuity, which, if established, and it often is on the scantiest of evidence, is grounds for the repatriation of artifacts and human remains, and that's a topic we've already discussed a bit on this channel. That's what NAGPRA, the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act, is all about. And does it matter that the ones that they've turned into heroes actually seem to have been a bunch of violent nutjobs who the other ones didn't like all that much? After all, Masada, imbued with all of this mythology, is a powerful symbol to the Jewish people. But what about all of the Jews and other people that haven't been discovered or didn't make it into the archaeological record? Does any of this give the descendants of those long ago people the right to this land now? I'm not saying yes, and I'm not saying no. The answer is definitely some mixture of sometimes, maybe, and it's complicated. And that's why there's a lot of fighting going on over there all the time. All I can say is they literally found a piece of pottery with my name on it, and that made the place feel personally special to me. Now, as a visit, it's pretty amazing, although I would hold off going there for now until things calm down in the neighborhood. But as a natural site, it's stunning. There is a cable car that can whisk you up to the top, but I'd actually opt for the walk up. If my memory serves me right, it's about 45 minutes uphill, but not too difficult. But it does get hot aside from the winter, so go early and bring plenty of water. The ruins at the top are somewhat reconstructed, as I understand, which definitely helps with the visualization, but is controversial from an archaeology standpoint. However, like many archaeology sites, it is ultimately just a pile of stones. So you really do need to go there with a guide to interpret what you're seeing so you can really appreciate it and know exactly what you're looking at in each spot. Now, I was there quite a long time ago in 2001, and since then, they've apparently made a bunch of improvements. Apparently, there's a small but interesting museum on site and some improved signage, which you definitely will want to follow on your way up because it is a mountain, and apparently a few years ago, a wayward hiker who did not follow the signs wandered off the path and actually fell to her death. And you're definitely going to want to take a tour given the remote location, but there are a lot of those on offer. And helpfully, the entrance fee is relatively modest at just about US dollars $8.50, depending on the current exchange rates. Now that's very welcome in this otherwise frightfully expensive country. And while you're there, you'll definitely also want to check out the Dead Sea, which you can jump in and float because of the very high salt content. But do me a favor, do not pee in there. Just Google it. I'm not going to talk anymore about that.
When nature's calling, don't be stalling. Use your common sense. Before you let it flow, find a place to go. Just don't whiz on the electric fence.
And in this country that really is an archaeological wonderland, for me, it was the most memorable site. I'd recommend a visit, but it does give you a lot to think about.